Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. We're going back to 1916, to a place where millions of young men lived for years, in conditions that would break most modern humans in about 48 hours. I'm talking about the trenches of World War I, not the Hollywood version with clean uniforms and heroic music, but the real ones, the muddy ones, the boring ones. The ones where you spent more time filling sandbags than fighting. Where your biggest enemy wasn't the Germans across no man's land, but the rats in your dugout, the lice in your uniform, and the crushing boredom between moments of absolute chaos. Tonight, we're going to explore what daily life was really like. The routines, the friendships, the small moments of humanity, and one of history's strangest and most misunderstood experiences. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear about something right from the start. You're not going to last, not even close. The year is 1916. You've just arrived at the Western Front. Somewhere in France, the train ride here was uncomfortable, cramped, full of nervous young men trying to look brave. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared you for what you're about to experience. As you step off the train, the first thing that hits you isn't the sound of gunfire, it's the smell. Imagine the worst garbage dump you've ever encountered. Multiply it by 1,000. Add rotting flesh, human waste, poison gas residue, and the sweet stench of gangrene. That's your new home fragrance. There's no getting used to it. You just learn to breathe through your mouth, which means you're basically tasting it all day. Congratulations. An officer, looking about as enthusiastic as a man heading to his own funeral, points you toward what he calls a communication trench. It's basically a muddy ditch, 6 feet deep, carved into the earth like a scar. The walls are held up by wooden supports, sandbags, and what you desperately hope isn't a human hand sticking out of the dirt. Spoiler alert, it probably is. The trench system you're entering isn't just one line. Oh no, that would be too simple. It's an entire underground city, stretching 475 miles from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. Think about that for a moment. 475 miles of muddy ditches, filled with young men who all made the same terrible life choice you did. There are 3 main lines: the front line, where you'll spend your time staring at Germans who are also wondering why they're here; the support trench, about 50 to 100 yards behind, where you go when you're not actively waiting to die; and the reserve trench, even further back, where officers drink tea and pretend they understand what's happening. These trenches are connected by communication trenches, zigzagging paths that let you move between positions without being immediately shot by a sniper. And let me tell you about snipers. They're patient, they're skilled, and they absolutely will not hesitate to shoot you in the head the moment you peek over the top to see what all the fuss is about. So don't. The trenches themselves are designed in a zigzag pattern, and there's actually a clever reason for this. If the enemy manages to jump into your trench, they can't just run down the length of it shooting everyone. The corners and bends create natural choke points. It's the one piece of smart design in an otherwise catastrophically stupid situation. Now, you might be wondering, where do I sleep? Excellent question. See that wooden platform along the side of the trench? That's called a fire step. During the day, you stand on it to shoot at the enemy. At night, if you're lucky, you get to lean against it and maybe close your eyes for an hour or two. There's no bed, no pillow, just you. Mud wall, and the constant fear that a random artillery shell will land directly on your head while you're dreaming about literally anywhere else. Some trenches have dugouts, little caves carved into the side of the trench. If you're really lucky, there might be room for you in one. But most likely, you'll be sleeping or attempting to sleep, standing up, leaning against sandbags that haven't been dry since 1914. Welcome to your new home. You'll be spending about 4 to 7 days here at a time. Then you'll rotate to the support trench, then reserve, then maybe, just maybe, you'll get a few days of rest, where you'll spend most of your time trying not to think about having to come back. The duck boards beneath your feet, those wooden planks that are supposed to keep you out of the mud, they don't work. Not really. The mud is everywhere. It's not like mud you've experienced before. This is special. It's a mixture of clay, water, and decomposing everything. It can be waist deep. It swallows equipment. It swallows men. There are stories, probably true, of soldiers stepping off the duck boards and simply vanishing into the mud, never to be seen again. During heavy rain, which happens constantly, the trenches become rivers. You'll be standing in water up to your knees, sometimes your waist, for days. And this isn't clean water. This is a delightful cocktail of rainwater, urine, and the liquefied remains of last month's casualties. But let's look on the bright side. At least the architecture is impressive. In a horrifying sort of way. These trenches weren't just randomly dug. They were engineered, planned. There are supply depots, latrines, command posts, medical stations. It's like a medieval city, but horizontal and full of people actively trying to kill you. And those sandbags you're looking at, each one was filled by hand, tied, stacked. There are thousands of them, millions across the entire front. Each one represents hours of backbreaking labor by men who were told they were building something important. They were building a prison. But nobody mentioned that part during recruitment. You might think that life in a trench is constant action, bullets flying, explosions, heroic charges. Wrong. The reality is so much worse. It's boring, mind-numbingly boring, with occasional bursts of absolute terror thrown in to keep things interesting. Let me walk you through a typical day in your new life. And by typical, I mean soul-crushing. The day starts at dawn, roughly an hour before sunrise, with what's cheerfully called Stand 2. This is when everyone in the trench, and I mean everyone, climbs up onto the fire step, fixes bayonets, and stares out into the darkness, waiting for an enemy attack. Why dawn, you ask? Because that's when attacks traditionally happened. Both sides know this. Both sides prepare for it. And yet, attacks still happen at dawn because military tactics in 1916 were about as advanced as a ham sandwich. You stand there, in the cold, in the dark, holding your rifle, trying not to fall asleep standing up. Your feet are already wet, your uniform smells like it died 3 weeks ago, and you're staring into a gray void called no man's land, watching for movement. If you're lucky, nothing happens. The sun comes up, revealing a landscape that looks like the surface of an alien planet. Mud, craters, barbed wire, and if you squint, you can see the German trenches, where other young men are having exactly the same miserable morning you are. After about an hour of this, if nobody's been shot, An officer blows a whistle. Stand to is over. Congratulations, you survived dawn. Time for breakfast. Now, let's talk about breakfast, because this is where things get truly depressing. You shuffle down from the fire step. Your legs are stiff. Your back aches. You've been standing in the same position for an hour, and you're about to be rewarded with, drum roll please, a tin of something that might be beef, might be horse, could be cat. The label says meat ration, but labels lie. There's also bread, if you can call it that. It's supposed to be fresh, but it takes about 8 days to get from the bakery to your trench. By the time it arrives, it's harder than the wooden stocks on your rifle. Soldiers have actually used stale bread as building material. It's that solid. Some clever soldiers figured out a solution. They'd tear up the rock-hard bread, mix it with whatever vegetables they could find, maybe some raisins if they were lucky, stuff it all into a sandbag, and boil it over a small fire. The result was a sort of bread pudding, which sounds better than it tasted, but at least it was chewable. By 1916, things got even more creative. Flour was in short supply, so they started making bread with dried ground turnips. Yes, turnip bread. It tasted exactly how you imagine turnip bread would taste, like despair, with a hint of root vegetable. After this gourmet breakfast, it's time for inspection. An officer or sergeant walks down the line, checking your rifle, your kit, your general state of being alive. This is important because if your rifle doesn't work, you're pretty useless. And if you look like you're about to die from disease, they might send you to a field hospital, which, depending on the day, might be either a blessing or a worse fate. Then comes the daily rum ration. And this, my friends, is the highlight of the morning. Each soldier gets a small amount of rum, issued by an officer. It's not much, barely a shot, but it's warm. It burns going down. And for about 10 minutes, you remember what it felt like to be happy. The rum ration was considered so important that officers were specifically ordered to ensure every man got his share. It was liquid courage, medical treatment, and the only reason some men got through the day without losing their minds. Now that you're fed, inspected, and slightly buzzed, it's time for the real work to begin. Chores. Yes, chores. Even in a war zone, somebody has to clean. First up, latrine duty. The latrines are basically holes dug at the back of the trench, covered with a wooden seat. They're disgusting. They smell like death. They're full of flies. And somebody has to maintain them. That somebody might be you. Congratulations. Then there's filling sandbags. Remember those thousands of sandbags holding up the trench walls? They don't fill themselves. You'll spend hours, days even, shoveling mud into bags, tying them, stacking them. Your back will scream, your hands will blister, and you'll wonder why you ever thought joining the army was a good idea. Repairing duckboards is another fun task. Those wooden planks rot, break, get blown apart by shells. They need constant replacement, so you'll be hammering, sawing, trying to create a stable, walking surface in a place where nothing is stable. Digging new trenches or extending old ones is an ongoing project. The trench system is never finished. It's always expanding, always adapting, always requiring more backbreaking labor from men who are already exhausted. And here's the kicker. All of this work has to be done below ground level. During the day, you can't show your head above the trench. Snipers are watching, waiting. 1 second of carelessness, one moment where you stand up to stretch your back, and that's it. You're done. So you work hunched over, bent double, in the mud, like some kind of troglodyte. Around midday, if you're lucky, there's a brief rest period, time for leisure activities. And by leisure, I mean sitting in the mud, writing letters home, reading if you have anything to read, or playing cards. The letters home are fascinating. Soldiers couldn't write about anything specific. Censors would read every letter, cross out anything deemed sensitive. But men still wrote thousands of letters, millions across the war, telling their families they were fine, that the food was good, that they'd be home soon. All lies, but comforting lies. Some soldiers kept journals, sketching the trenches, writing poetry, describing their experiences. These journals are some of the most valuable historical documents we have. Raw, unfiltered accounts of what it was really like. Card games were popular. Gambling too. Though what you were gambling for is anyone's guess. You didn't have money, you barely had possessions. But men would bet their rum rations, extra food, letters from home, anything to feel like they had some control over their lives. One soldier in the London regiment remembered his trench having names. The main trenches were named after famous London streets: Piccadilly, Regent Street, Oxford Circus. When trenches intersected, they'd call it Piccadilly Circus. It was a small touch of home, a reminder that somewhere, far away, there was a world that still made sense. As afternoon turns to evening, the routine changes slightly. You might be assigned sentry duty, standing watch, staring out into no man's land, watching for enemy movement. It's boring, tense, and absolutely critical. Because if the enemy decides to raid your trench, you need to see them coming. Or you might be part of a work party, going out into no man's land at night to repair barbed wire defenses. This is terrifying. You're outside the trench, exposed, visible. Enemy snipers have night vision, sort of. They know the layout of the land, they're listening for sounds, and you're trying to fix wire without making noise, without being seen, without dying. Finally, as darkness falls completely, you do it all over again. Stand to at dusk, just like at dawn, and then another hour of standing on the fire step, watching, waiting, hoping nobody attacks. And then, if you're very lucky, you get to sleep for a few hours, standing up or leaning against a mud wall with rats running across your feet while artillery shells explode in the distance, and you wonder, very seriously, how you ended up here. In this hole, in this mud, in this war. That doesn't seem to have a purpose anymore. This is your daily routine, day after day, week after week, for months, sometimes years. And people wonder why shell shock was so common. Now, let's talk about the wildlife, because you're not alone in these trenches. Oh no, you've got company, lots of company, and none of it is good company. First, let's discuss the rats. Not the cute little pet store rats, not the laboratory rats used in science experiments. No, these are trench rats. And they're in a league of their own. These rats grew big, really big. Some soldiers describe them as being as large as cats. This is an exaggeration when you have unlimited food supply. And that food supply is, well, let's just say abundant organic matter. Rats thrive, they multiply, they grow. They become apex predators of the trench ecosystem. A single rat couple could produce up to 900 offspring in a year. Think about that. 900 baby rats, all growing up in your trench, all looking for food. And guess what looks like food to a hungry rat? Everything. Your rations, your bread, your emergency chocolate. Rats would steal food right out of your pack. They'd chew through bags, boxes, even metal containers if they were determined enough. Soldiers learned quickly to never leave food unattended, not even for a moment. But here's where it gets really unpleasant. Rats didn't just eat food. They'd bite sleeping soldiers. Yes. While you're trying to get a few hours of rest, leaning against a muddy wall, a rat might decide to take a taste of your hand, your face, your ear. Soldiers would wake up with bite marks, bleeding, infected, all because a rat got hungry in the night. And the sounds they made, scratching, squeaking, the patter of tiny feet running along the duckboards. It was constant, day and night, a reminder that you were living in their home, not the other way around. Soldiers tried everything to get rid of them, shooting them, but bullets were precious, and shooting inside a trench was dangerous. Bayonets, clubs. Some men would organize rat hunting parties, competitions to see who could kill the most rats in a night. The record numbers were impressive and depressing, but it was futile. For every rat killed, 5 more appeared. They were everywhere. In the dugouts, in the supply stores, running across no man's land at night. One soldier swore that rats could sense incoming artillery fire. They'd disappear minutes before a bombardment, hiding deep in their burrows, then emerge after the shells stopped falling, like tiny furry prophets of doom. Now, if you thought rats were bad, let me introduce you to their smaller cousins, lice. Every soldier had lice, every single one. It wasn't a question of if, but how many thousands you were hosting on your body at any given moment. Lice lived in the seams of your uniform, tiny eggs nestled in the fabric, warm, safe, waiting to hatch. And once they hatched, they'd feed on you, crawling across your skin, biting, leaving red welts that itched like fire. The itching was constant, maddening. You'd scratch until you bled, which of course just made things worse, because now you had open wounds in a trench filled with every disease known to medical science. Soldiers developed a ritual called chatting, which sounds pleasant until you realize it meant sitting with a fellow soldier, taking off your shirt, and picking lice out of the seams, one by one, for hours. You'd crush them between your fingernails, hearing a satisfying pop, knowing you'd just killed one of the thousands living on your body. But here's the really depressing part. Even when uniforms were washed, which wasn't often, and even when they were treated with delousing powder, which wasn't often, the eggs survived, tucked deep in the fabric, waiting. Within hours of putting your clean uniform back on, body heat would activate the eggs, they'd hatch, and you'd be right back where you started. Lice weren't just annoying, they spread disease, trench fever, a bacterial infection that caused high fever, severe pain, weakness. It could knock a soldier out of action for weeks. There was no cure, just rest and hope. Then there were the flies. Oh, the flies. Well, during summer months, when the weather warmed up, flies appeared in biblical swarms. They bred in the mud, in the waste, in the unburied remains, scattered across no man's land. And they were everywhere. They'd land on your food, making it impossible to eat without swallowing a few. They'd crawl across your face while you tried to sleep. They'd get in your mouth, your nose, your eyes. And yes, they spread disease, dysentery, cholera, typhoid, all courtesy of flies that had previously been dining on something you didn't want to think about. Some trenches were plagued with mosquitoes, breeding in the standing water, biting constantly, carrying malaria, adding one more miserable condition to the list of things that could kill you. But wait, there's more. Slugs. Yes, slugs. In wet weather, slugs would appear by the thousands, crawling up the trench walls, across the duck boards. They didn't bite or spread disease. They were just there, slimy, gross. A reminder that nature was reclaiming this man-made hellscape one invertebrate at a time. Although, fun fact, slugs were actually useful. Soldiers discovered that slugs were extremely sensitive to poison gas, more sensitive than humans. If you saw slugs suddenly contract and die, you knew gas was coming. You had maybe 30 seconds to get your gas mask on, so thanks, slugs. You're gross. But you saved lives. Frogs were common too, especially near flooded trenches. Their croaking at night was actually comforting to some soldiers. A sound of life, of nature, a reminder that not everything was trying to kill you, just most things. Now, here's a strange twist in this story. Some soldiers, in the midst of all this horror, decided to adopt pets. Yes, pets. In the trenches, dogs were the most popular. Small terriers, spaniels, mutts found wandering near the front. Soldiers would adopt them, feed them scraps, let them sleep in the dugouts. These dogs became mascots, lucky charms, sources of comfort in an uncomfortable world. Cats were common too. They were excellent ratters. A good mouser could keep a section of trench relatively rodent-free. Plus, cats were warm, soft, pettable. When you're covered in mud and misery, petting a cat is surprisingly therapeutic. But the pets got weird. Monkeys. Yes, monkeys. Some units near French zoos adopted monkeys as mascots. Goats, pigs. There's even records of soldiers keeping a bear cub, which eventually grew to full size and had to be sent to the London Zoo. That bear, named Winnie, later became the inspiration for Winnie the Pooh. One unit had a lion cub named Susan. Another had a fox. There's a photo of an American soldier holding a baby raccoon. Mascots weren't just allowed, they were encouraged. They boosted morale, gave men something to care about, something to protect, something that wasn't actively trying to kill them. These animals lived alongside the soldiers, ate the same food, endured the same conditions, and remarkably, many survived. At war's end, soldiers tried to bring their pets home, sneaking them onto ships, hiding them in duffel bags. Not all made it, but enough did that. There are descendants of WWI trench dogs and cats still around today. So yes, you're sharing your trench with rats the size of small dogs, lice numbering in the thousands, flies, mosquitoes, slugs, and possibly a pet monkey named Gerald who's having just as bad a time as you are. Welcome to the ecosystem. Here's something nobody tells you about war. It's boring, extremely boring. You'd think, given that you're in an active war zone, surrounded by enemies, with artillery shells occasionally exploding nearby, that every moment would be filled with tension, action, drama. But no, most of your time in the trenches is spent waiting for orders, waiting for food, waiting for your rotation to end, waiting for the war to end, waiting for literally anything to happen. One soldier described it perfectly. He said the most common state of being in a trench was doing nothing, just standing around, watching mud dry, which, given how wet everything was a metaphor, not an actual activity. Military commanders knew this was a problem. Bored soldiers get into trouble. They question orders. They think too much about their situation. They realize how utterly pointless this all is. So, the British military encouraged creativity, gave soldiers materials, time, permission to do something, anything, to keep their minds occupied. And boy, did soldiers get creative. Let me tell you about the Wipers' Times. In 1916, British soldiers stationed near Ypres, which they cheerfully mispronounced as Wipers because correct French pronunciation is for people not actively being shot at, found an abandoned printing press in a bombed-out building. 2 officers, Captain Fred Roberts and Lieutenant Jack Pearson, had a brilliant idea. Let's make a newspaper, and not just any newspaper, a satire newspaper, poking fun at the war, the commanders, the whole ridiculous situation they found themselves in. The first issue of the Wipers' Times hit the trenches like a breath of fresh air. It was filled with poems, essays, jokes, fake advertisements, an absolutely savage mockery of everyone and everything involved in the war. One fake advertisement read, "Are you unhappy? Do you hate your company commander? Then buy him one of our new patent tip duck boards. You get him on the end. The duck board does the rest. Guaranteed to smack your officer right in the face." They ran a serial called Herlock Sholmes, a parody of Sherlock Holmes. But set in the trenches, Sholmes was addicted to using a vermeil sprayer, which was a device for dispersing gas. Instead of morphine, he'd solve mysteries like the case of the missing rum ration. Completely absurd, completely brilliant. There was a sports section, advertising, good shooting to be had in Railway Wood, but game is getting wilder. Dark humor at its finest. They published poetry. Some sincere, some mocking the flowery patriotic poems being written back home by people who had never seen a trench. One soldier wrote a poem about rats, describing them as his companions in the night. It was both touching and disturbing. The Wipers' Times changed names as the troops moved to different locations. It became the Somme Times, the BEF Times. But it always maintained its irreverent spirit. Soldiers would pass copies down the line, reading them by candlelight, laughing at jokes that only someone living in hell could truly appreciate. The paper had a huge readership. Everyone wanted a copy. It reminded them that despite everything, despite the mud and the rats and the constant fear, they were still human. They could still laugh. They could still mock authority, even when that authority could have you shot for insubordination. Other trenches developed their own newspapers, journals, newsletters, all filled with dark humor, poetry, artwork. It was a cultural explosion in the worst possible place. Soldiers who were artists before the war, or who discovered they had talent, drew pictures, sketches of a trench life, portraits of their comrades, political cartoons. Some of these drawings survived. They're in museums now. Raw, honest depictions of life in the trenches. Others took up writing, keeping detailed diaries, describing every aspect of their experience, the food, the smells, the sounds, the feelings. These diaries weren't meant for publication. They were just men trying to process what was happening to them, trying to make sense of the senseless. Music was another escape. Soldiers sang constantly, marching songs, drinking songs, made up songs about their officers, popular tunes from home with new, often obscene lyrics. One famous song went, We're here because we're here because we're here because we're here, sung to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. It was both funny and existential, a commentary on the futility of it all. When soldiers had access to instruments, harmonicas, tin whistles, improvised drums, they'd form bands, playing music in the evenings before stand to. It lifted spirits, made time pass faster, reminded everyone of better days. Card games were endless. Poker, bridge, any game that could be played with a worn deck of cards. Gambling wasn't officially allowed, but everyone did it anyway. What were they going to do? Send you to the front lines? You were already there. Reading was popular. If you could get books, letters from home were read over and over until the paper wore thin. Some soldiers memorized entire letters. Every word their wife, mother, sister wrote. It was a connection to the world they'd left behind. Magazines and newspapers from home were passed around until they fell apart. Men would read 3-month-old news, looking at pictures of places that seemed like they were on another planet. Clean streets, smiling people, normal life. But here's the really interesting part. The boredom had a purpose. It kept men sane. When you're playing cards, or reading a letter, or laughing at a joke in the wipers times, you're not thinking about the fact that tomorrow you might have to go over the top. You're not dwelling on the friends you've lost. You're just being human. Military psychologists, who didn't really exist yet but would later study this, realized that these creative outlets, these moments of normalcy, were essential for mental health. Soldiers who stayed engaged, who had hobbies, who connected with their comrades, were less likely to break down, less likely to develop severe shell shock. So yes, war is boring, long stretches of tedium, punctuated by brief moments of absolute terror. And humans, being the adaptable creatures we are, found ways to make even the boring parts bearable. We wrote newspapers in the mud, sang songs in the darkness, and convinced ourselves that maybe, just maybe, this would all be over soon. Let's talk about your feet. Because in a few days, you're going to have a very serious relationship with your feet, and not in a good way. You've been standing in water, cold water, mixed with mud, waste, and various other substances you don't want to think about. For days, your boots haven't been dry since you put them on. And your socks, well, socks are a distant memory. What's happening to your feet right now, though you don't know it yet, is a condition called trench foot, and it's about to become your new worst nightmare. Trench foot occurs when feet are exposed to cold, wet conditions for prolonged periods. The constant moisture causes the skin to break down, blood vessels constrict, tissue starts to die, and if left untreated, you can literally lose your feet. The first sign is numbness. Your feet stop hurting, which sounds good, until you realize that's because the nerves are dying. Then comes swelling. Your feet blow up like balloons. Your boots, already tight, become tourniquets. Then the color changes. First white, then red. Then, if you're really unlucky, black and purple. That's tissue death. Necrosis, the medical term for your feet are rotting while still attached to your body. The British Army alone reported about 75,000 cases of trench foot during the war. 75,000. That's more casualties than some major battles. And these weren't mild cases. Many soldiers lost toes. Some lost entire feet. All because they stood in water for too long. The treatment was simple in theory. Get your feet dry. Warm them slowly. Massage them to restore circulation. Change your socks regularly. Rub whale oil into the skin to create a protective barrier. Whale oil, yes, whale oil, because nothing says modern warfare like rubbing blubber on your feet. But here's the problem. You couldn't keep your feet dry. The trenches were flooded. There was nowhere to go. No dry spot to rest. You stood in water because that's where you were stationed. And if you abandoned your post to dry your feet, that was desertion, which carried the death penalty. So, the Army developed a system. Soldiers were paired up, each man responsible for his partner's feet. Not his own, his partner's, twice a day. You'd inspect your buddy's feet, make sure he was changing his socks, rubbing in whale oil, keeping his boots as dry as possible. This wasn't optional. Officers would check. If your partner developed trench foot and you were both in trouble, it turned foot care into a team sport. Some units issued 3 pairs of socks per man. The theory being 1 pair on, 1 pair drying inside your jacket from body heat, 1 pair stored. You'd rotate them throughout the day. It helped slightly. Later in the war, in 1918, the Americans issued what was called a Pershing boot, named after General John Pershing. It was more waterproof than previous boots, had better insulation. It reduced trench foot cases significantly, but by then, the war was almost over, and hundreds of thousands of men had already suffered. Now, let's talk about the recovery process. If you developed trench foot and it was caught early, you'd be sent to a field hospital, your boots removed, your feet examined by a doctor who'd seen this 1,000 times before. If you were lucky, just mild tissue damage, they'd wrap your feet, give you dry socks, tell you to stay off them for a few days, then send you back to the trenches, where you'd immediately stand in water again and start the whole process over, if you were less lucky. Amputation. They'd take your toes, sometimes the front half of your foot, sometimes, if gangrene had set in, the entire foot up to the ankle. And here's the really fun part. This was done with limited anesthesia in a tent while you could hear the sounds of artillery fire nearby. Survivors describe the pain as indescribable, not just the physical pain of losing body parts, but the emotional pain of knowing you'd never walk properly again, never run, never dance, never feel sand between your toes at the beach. And here's something darkly ironic. Some soldiers almost welcomed trench foot because it meant a ticket home, a blighty wound, they called it, named after Britain. If your injury was serious enough, you'd be sent back to England to recover, away from the trenches, away from the war. So some men, desperate to escape, would deliberately neglect their feet, not change socks, not apply whale oil, stand in the deepest water they could find, hoping to develop trench foot severe enough to get sent home, but not so severe they'd lose their feet entirely. It was a gamble, and many lost. Officers were trained to watch for this. Soldiers deliberately injuring themselves to escape duty was considered cowardice, punishable by military tribunal. Some men were actually court-martialed for self-inflicted trench foot. Imagine that. Prosecuted for letting your feet rot. The psychological impact of trench foot extended beyond the individual. When you saw a comrade, someone you'd served with, lose his feet to gangrene, it hit home. This could happen to you at any moment. For something as simple as standing in water, it made men obsessive about foot care. checking constantly, changing socks, removing boots whenever possible. Even in the middle of the night, even during stand-to, men would quickly unlace, change socks, lace back up, all while watching for enemy movement. And the smell, let's not forget the smell. Trench foot smelled like death, literally. Rotting tissue has a very particular odor, sharp, sweet, unmistakable. When you smelled it, you knew. Someone nearby was losing their feet. So, to review, you're standing in freezing water. For days, your feet are slowly dying. The solution is whale oil and hope. And if it gets bad enough, they'll cut pieces of you off in a tent with a saw, and people wonder why soldiers drank heavily in the midst of all this horror, all this mud and death and decay. There was one thing that kept soldiers going, one bright spot in an otherwise endless dark tunnel. Mail call, twice a week, if you were lucky. An officer would appear with a sack of letters, parcels, packages from home, and for those few minutes, the war stopped. Time froze. Everyone gathered around, hoping, praying that their name would be called. The British postal system during WWI was actually remarkable. At the war's peak, they were delivering about 12 million letters per week. 12 million, every week, for 4 years. That's a lot of mail. Letters took anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks to arrive, depending on where you were, how bad the roads were, whether the mail truck had been blown up, the usual logistical challenges. But they arrived, almost always, through rain, snow, artillery fire, gas attacks. The mail got through because everyone, from generals to privates, understood that mail wasn't just paper. It was hope. It was a reminder that somewhere, beyond the trenches, life continued. When your name was called, when you received a letter, everything else disappeared. You'd find a quiet spot, as quiet as a trench could be, and you'd read, slowly, savoring every word, every detail about home. Your mother writing about the garden, your sister complaining about school, your wife telling you about the neighbors, mundane, ordinary, beautiful details about a world that seemed increasingly unreal. Some men would read their letters dozens of times, memorizing them, until the paper wore thin and started to fall apart. Then they'd carefully store them, usually in a waterproof pouch, close to their heart, literally. Writing back was its own ritual. You'd find a quiet moment, pull out a pencil and paper, and try to figure out what to say. You couldn't tell the truth. That was forbidden. Letters were censored. Officers would read them, cross out anything sensitive, anything about troop movements, casualties, conditions, morale. So you lied. You told them you were fine, that the food was good, that you were staying safe, that you'd be home soon. All lies, comforting lies, but lies nonetheless. Some soldiers became poets, writing beautiful letters, describing the French countryside, the sunsets, the camaraderie with their fellow soldiers. They painted a picture of a war that didn't exist, a clean, noble war, because they didn't want their families to know the truth. Others were honest, in small ways. They'd hint at the conditions, mention being tired, or that they missed dry socks. Their families, reading between the lines, could guess what wasn't being said. The parcels from home were treasures. Mothers, wives, sisters would send packages filled with everything. Socks, always socks, chocolate, cigarettes, books, newspapers, sometimes homemade food, though that rarely survived the journey in edible condition. But it didn't matter if the cake arrived as crumbs or if the cookies were dust. It was from home. It smelled like home. and you'd share it with your comrades, passing around broken pieces of something your mother made in her kitchen in a world that seemed impossible to reach. Photographs were precious. Men would carry photos of their families, their sweethearts, their dogs, looking at them during quiet moments, reminding themselves why they were here, what they were fighting for. Some photos were kept in special cases, waterproof, protected from the mud and moisture. Others were carried in pockets, growing worn and faded from constant handling. There's a famous story, probably apocryphal but repeated by many soldiers, about a man who kept a photo of his wife in his breast pocket, right over his heart. During a battle, a bullet struck him in the chest and stopped. The photo had absorbed the impact, saving his life. True or not, men believed it, and they kept their photos close. But mail call had a dark side too. Not everyone got letters. Some men, especially those from broken families, or those who'd been away so long their connections had faded, would stand there, hoping, and their names would never be called. The look on a soldier's face when everyone else got mail. And he didn't. That was heartbreaking. Units tried to help. Soldiers would write to strangers back home, asking them to send letters, any letters, to the men who had none. And sometimes, the letters that arrived were the worst kind. Dear John letters, women breaking off engagements, wives asking for divorces, messages saying that sweethearts had married someone else, someone who stayed home, someone safe. These letters devastated men. Soldiers would read them, then sit quietly, not speaking, processing the news that while they were in hell, their lives back home were falling apart. Officers were trained to watch for this, to provide support, to prevent what sometimes happened when a man decided he had nothing left to live for. Death notifications arrived too, letters from families telling soldiers that their father had died, their brother, their sister, and they couldn't go home, couldn't attend the funeral, couldn't say goodbye. They just had to keep going, stay in the trench, do their duty. So mail call was joy and pain mixed together, hope and heartbreak delivered in paper form. But it was still better than no mail at all, because those letters, those connections to home, were the only thing reminding soldiers they were human, that they had names, had families, had lives. Without mail, you weren't a person anymore. You were just a soldier, a number, a body in a trench, and nobody wanted to be just a number. Let's talk about food, or more accurately, let's talk about what passed for food in the trenches. The British Army employed 300,000 people, 300,000, just to cook and supply food to the troops. That's more people than lived in some cities, all dedicated to the singular purpose of keeping soldiers fed. And yet, despite this massive infrastructure, the food was, let's be kind and say, not great. Your daily ration consisted of canned meat, usually beef, sometimes mutton, occasionally something the label claimed was chicken but was almost certainly not. The cans were old, dented, sometimes dated from the Boer War, which ended in 1902. You'd open a can of meat and find a gelatinous mass, gray, slimy, with a smell that made you question your life choices, but you ate it anyway, because it was food, and food was fuel, and fuel kept you alive. Soldiers had nicknames for everything. Canned beef was called bully beef, though nobody knows why. Bully implies something good. There was nothing good about this beef. Then there was bread, which, as mentioned earlier, took about 8 days to get from bakery to front line. By the time it arrived, it had achieved a hardness previously unknown to science. You couldn't bite it. You couldn't break it with your hands. Some soldiers joked that it could stop a bullet. They might not have been joking, but soldiers, being resourceful, figured out solutions. The sandbag stew method became famous. Tear up the bread, add whatever vegetables you could scavenge, some tinned meat, a bit of water, stuff it all in a sandbag, tie it shut, boil it over a small fire. The result was edible, barely. By 1916, the bread situation got worse. Flour shortages meant they started using alternative ingredients, like turnips. They'd dry turnips, grind them into powder, mix it with whatever flour they had, and bake it into bread-shaped objects. Turnip bread tasted, well, imagine biting into a gym sock that had been soaked in turnip juice, then left in the sun for a week. That's turnip bread. But again, you ate it because the alternative was starvation. Vegetables appeared occasionally, mostly potatoes, onions, carrots, all boiled into a sort of grayish mush. Seasoning was not a thing. Salt, if you were lucky, maybe some pepper, but spices, herbs, anything that made food taste like food. Those were luxuries for officers and people back home. The main meal was often described as pea soup with horse meat. And yes, horse meat, real horse meat. From horses that had served alongside the troops, had carried supplies, had been friends in their own way. Then they'd been injured or worn out and turned into soup. Soldiers knew this. They weren't stupid, but they ate it anyway because protein was protein. And sentimentality didn't fill your stomach. Occasionally, very occasionally, fresh meat would arrive, beef, mutton, even pork. The cooks would prepare an actual meal with flavor, with texture. These were celebrated events. Men would talk about them for weeks afterward. But usually, food was just fuel, calories consumed to maintain basic functionality. Nobody expected it to taste good. Nobody expected variety. You just ate. Drinking water was its own adventure. Water was brought to the front in large containers, usually the same containers that had previously held gasoline, or oil, or something else equally undrinkable. They'd clean the containers, supposedly, but the residue remained. Your water tasted like petroleum. Every sip, for months, you got used to it, sort of. In the same way you get used to having lice. It never stopped being unpleasant. You just stopped noticing how unpleasant it was. Tea was popular, extremely popular, because tea covered the taste of gasoline water. Soldiers drank tea constantly. Hot tea, warm tea, cold tea. It didn't matter. Anything to mask the flavor. And then there was the rum ration, which we mentioned earlier, but deserves another mention here, because rum wasn't just a drink. It was medicine. It was courage. It was the only thing between soldiers and complete despair. Each morning, after stand to, an officer would distribute rum, a small amount, maybe 2 tablespoons per man. It was taken straight, no mixing, no ice, just straight rum, at dawn, on an empty stomach. The effect was immediate, warmth spreading through your body, the edge of fear dulled slightly. For a few minutes, you felt almost human. Some soldiers didn't drink, religious reasons, personal preference, or they just didn't like alcohol. Those men would trade their rum ration for extra food, for cigarettes, for favors. It became an unofficial currency. Officers got more rum than enlisted men, and better quality rum, because the class system didn't stop just because there was a war on. This caused resentment obviously, but nobody complained too loudly, because complaining got you extra duty. Food preparation was often done by the soldiers themselves. There were field kitchens behind the lines where actual cooks prepared meals. But getting hot food from the kitchen to the frontline trench, while under enemy observation, that was challenging. Sometimes food arrived cold. Sometimes it arrived as a pile of spillage. Sometimes it didn't arrive at all. The delivery men were shot, or the container hit by shrapnel, so soldiers learned to cook using small portable stoves or just open fires when fires were allowed, which wasn't often because smoke gave away your position. They'd boil water for tea, heat up canned meat, make a sort of improvised stew from whatever they had. The results were rarely appetizing, but they were warm, and warmth counted for a lot. Cigarettes were another form of sustenance, not food, obviously, but psychologically, they mattered. Smoking gave you something to do with your hands, something to focus on, a way to pass time. Soldiers smoked constantly, during breaks, while on sentry duty. Before going over the top, the smoke also helped mask the smell, which, given the smells of the trenches, was a significant benefit. Cigarettes were included in rations provided by the Army or sent from home in parcels. Some brands were better than others, but honestly, when you're smoking in a trench, quality doesn't matter much. You're not savoring it. You're just smoking. Now, here's something interesting. Despite the terrible food, despite the limited rations, despite everything, soldiers rarely starved. They were hungry, often. But actual starvation was uncommon. The Army understood that starving soldiers don't fight well, so they made sure, above all else, that food reached the front. It might be awful food, but it was food. Compare this to some other armies. The Russian army, for example, had serious food supply problems. Soldiers were genuinely starving, weakened by malnutrition. That contributed to their eventual collapse. The British, French, Americans, they kept their soldiers fed, not well fed, but fed. So yes, the food was terrible. Yes, you'd dream about your mother's cooking. Yes, you'd fantasize about a real meal with flavor, with warmth, with love. But you survived. You ate your turnip bread, your bully beef, your gasoline-flavored tea, and you kept going, because what choice did you have? Sleep. That's all you want. Just a few hours of uninterrupted unconsciousness, where you don't dream about trenches, don't wake up covered in rats, don't hear artillery fire, but sleep in a trench is more of a theoretical concept than a practical reality. Let's start with where you sleep, because bed is too generous a term for what you're dealing with. If you're extremely lucky, you might have access to a dugout, a small cave carved into the side of the trench, maybe 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, with a ceiling low enough that you can't sit up straight. The dugout is reinforced with wooden boards, covered with corrugated metal, sandbags on top. The idea is that if a shell lands nearby, the dugout will protect you. The reality is, if a shell lands directly on your dugout, you'll be buried alive, but you'll die quickly. So there's that. Inside the dugout, there's a wooden platform. Your bed, it's not padded. It's not comfortable. It's literally just boards, maybe with some straw thrown on top if previous occupants were thoughtful. You lie down on these boards, and you try to convince your body that this is rest. But most soldiers don't have dugouts. Most sleep on the fire step, that wooden ledge running along the trench wall. During the day, you stand on it to shoot at the enemy. At night, you try to sleep on it. Your sleeping position is complicated. You can't lie flat. There's not enough room. So you lean one shoulder against the mud wall, knees bent, head tilted at an angle that guarantees neck pain. And you really try, to sleep. Some soldiers slept standing up, truly standing, leaning against the trench wall, too exhausted to care about comfort, just vertical sleeping, like horses. It wasn't good sleep, but it was something. The cold made sleep nearly impossible. Winter temperatures drop below freezing. You're wearing every piece of clothing you own, and you're still cold. Hypothermia cold, the kind that makes your teeth chatter so hard you think they might break. Your greatcoat, that heavy wool coat every soldier is issued, becomes your blanket, your mattress, your pillow, everything. You wrap it around yourself, tuck it under your feet, cover your head, and huddle. Just huddle. But wet wool doesn't insulate. Not really. So you're cold and damp and miserable, and somehow you fall asleep for a few minutes, maybe an hour if you're lucky. Then the rats wake you up, running across your face, biting your hands, searching your pockets for food. You swat at them. They scatter. You try to fall back asleep. They return. This cycle repeats all night. Or lice wake you up. The itching becomes unbearable. You scratch, which wakes you fully. Now you're awake, itching, cold, with rats staring at you from 3 feet away. Sleep seems impossible. Yet somehow, exhaustion wins. Artillery fire is another sleep disruptor. Even when you're not being directly targeted, the sound of shells exploding, even a mile away, travels, echoes, shakes the ground. Each explosion jerks you awake, heart pounding, wondering if the next one will land closer. During artillery barrages, which could last for hours, sleep is impossible. You just wait, pressed against the trench wall, trying to make yourself small, praying the bombardment ends soon. Sentry duty meant someone was always awake, walking past you, making noise, accidentally kicking you, whispering to the next sentry. You'd hear fragments of conversation, enough to keep you from deep sleep, but not enough to be interesting. Morning stand meant your sleep was always interrupted at dawn. No matter how little sleep you'd gotten, no matter how exhausted you were, at dawn, you woke, you stood, you waited for an attack that usually didn't come. This sleep deprivation was cumulative, day after day, week after week, of 3 or 4 hours of interrupted sleep. You became a zombie, operating on autopilot. Your reaction time slowed, your judgment impaired, your mood. Well, imagine your mood after months of this. Some soldiers developed the ability to sleep anywhere, under any conditions. It was a survival skill. You'd see men sleeping during artillery barrages, sleeping while standing, sleeping in the middle of conversations. Their brains just shut down, taking whatever rest they could get. Power naps became an art form, 2 minutes leaning against a wall, 5 minutes sitting on an ammunition box. Every second of sleep counted. You learned to fall asleep instantly and wake up just as quickly. Dreams, when you managed to have them, were strange. Sometimes you dream of home, of comfort, of your bed, clean sheets, your mother's cooking. These dreams were beautiful until you woke up and reality hit you like a cold shower. Other times, you dream of the trenches, of being buried alive, of drowning in mud, of rats. These dreams were your brain processing trauma, trying to make sense of the insane situation you were in. Some soldiers experienced lucid dreams, where they knew they were dreaming and would try to stay asleep, to remain in the dream, because even a bad dream was better than waking reality. Nightmares were common. Men would wake up screaming, thrashing, thinking they were under attack. Their comrades would calm them, tell them it was just a dream. They'd settle back down, heart racing, knowing they probably wouldn't sleep again that night. Shell shock made sleep even worse. Men with severe trauma would be unable to sleep at all. They'd lie awake, staring, reliving attacks, hearing sounds that weren't there. Eventually, they'd collapse from exhaustion. But even then, true rest eluded them. The rotation system helped. After 4 to 7 days in the front line, you'd move to the support, trench, then reserve, and reserve. You might have actual cots, or at least cleaner straw. And crucially, you'd be further from enemy fire, which meant slightly better sleep, rest periods. When you'd rotate completely out of the trenches, were supposed to provide real recovery. You'd be billeted in a village or a barn, somewhere with a roof that didn't leak, and you'd sleep for hours, for days, catching up on months of deficit. But even during rest, many soldiers couldn't sleep. Their bodies had forgotten how. They'd lie in an actual bed, on an actual mattress, and stare at the ceiling, too wired to relax, too traumatized to rest. So, to summarize, sleep in the trenches was standing up while leaning against mud, on wooden planks covered in questionable straw, interrupted by rats and artillery, limited to a few hours per night, for months at a time. And people ask why veterans look tired in photographs. Personal hygiene in the trenches was, well, let's just say it was not a priority. Not because soldiers didn't care, but because maintaining hygiene in a muddy hole filled with water and waste was optimistic. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. You didn't, not really, not for weeks, sometimes months. There were no showers in the trenches, no bathtubs, no running water, no facilities at all. You had drinking water, which tasted like gasoline, and you had mud water, which was everywhere. Neither were suitable for washing, occasionally. When you rotated to reserve or rest areas, you might find a makeshift shower facility, usually a large bucket with holes punched in the bottom, hanging from a tree. You'd stand underneath. Someone would dump water through. You'd have maybe 30 seconds to soap up and rinse, using soap that barely lathered and water that was ice cold. This was luxury. This was heaven, because it was the first time in weeks you'd been properly wet with clean water. But most of the time, you just smelled. Everyone smelled. Like, it wasn't personal, it was universal. After a while, your nose stopped registering it, You became nose blind to the overwhelming odor of unwashed humanity, your uniform, that wool tunic, those pants, that shirt. You wore them every day. For months, they were never washed, never dried out, never cleaned. They absorbed sweat, mud, blood, everything, and turned into a sort of crusty second skin. Some soldiers describe their uniforms as being able to stand up on their own. If you took off your jacket and set it in the corner, it stayed upright, stiff with accumulated filth. Undergarments, when they existed, were even worse. Most soldiers wore a simple shirt and shorts underneath, cotton or linen, meant to be changed regularly, but changed with what? You had one set, maybe two if you were lucky. There was no laundry service, no way to wash and dry them in time to wear them again, so you wore them for weeks until they disintegrated, or until you could scavenge replacements from soldiers who no longer needed them. Socks, as mentioned, were critical for preventing trench foot, so the Army actually did provide multiple pairs, and soldiers were ordered to change them regularly. This was one area where hygiene was enforced because trench foot reduced fighting capability, and armies care about fighting capability, but changing socks didn't mean washing socks. Old socks were stuffed in pockets or hung over equipment to dry. They remained unwashed, just cycled from wet and filthy to dry and filthy. Hair care was not a thing. Haircuts happened irregularly, usually with dull scissors or a knife. Sometimes another soldier would trim your hair. Sometimes you'd do it yourself with shaky hands. The results were uneven. Many soldiers just let their hair grow. Months would pass. Hair would become matted, filled with lice, impossible to comb. Some men would shave their heads entirely just to deal with the lice problem. But then you had no protection from the cold. So, trade-offs. Shaving was a daily requirement, sort of. Officers were supposed to maintain appearances. Enlisted men too, but with what? You had cold water, a dull razor, and maybe some soap. If you were lucky, most soldiers grew beards, or attempted to. The results were patchy, scraggly, but it was easier than trying to shave with a blunt blade and no mirror. Some units were strict about shaving. Officers would inspect, punish soldiers who looked too scruffy, because apparently maintaining the illusion of military discipline was more important than comfort or common sense, dental hygiene. Let's not even pretend. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss. You ate with your teeth. They rotted with time. And when they hurt, you dealt with it. Or you found someone with pliers to pull them out. Cavities were universal, gum disease common, tooth abscesses excruciating. Some soldiers lost all their teeth by the end of the war. Malnutrition, poor diet, and complete lack of dental care created perfect conditions for oral destruction. The latrines, those communal toilets, were another level of awful. They were basically pits dug at the rear of the trench, deep enough to serve their purpose. Covered with a wooden board with holes cut in it. No privacy, no partitions, just a board with holes. You'd sit there, in full view of everyone, doing your business, while trying to maintain some shred of dignity. Sometimes multiple people would use the latrine simultaneously because there weren't enough holes for everyone. The smell was indescribable, even by trench standards. The latrines smelled worse than anything else. And that's saying something. Toilet paper didn't exist, not really. You used whatever was available. Old newspaper, torn up letters, leaves if you were outside, your hand if you were desperate. Then you'd try to clean your hand with something, anything, maybe some mud, maybe nothing. This lack of hygiene contributed to disease. Dysentery was rampant, a bacterial infection causing severe diarrhea, dehydration, weakness. Soldiers would spend hours running back and forth to the latrine, losing fluids, losing weight, losing strength. Cholera appeared in some areas, typhoid fever, all spread by contaminated water and poor sanitation. Men would die from disease, not from bullets, not from shells, but from drinking water contaminated with human waste. The Army tried, they really did. Medical officers gave lectures about hygiene, distributed pamphlets, explained that washing hands could prevent disease. But when you don't have clean water to wash hands with, the advice is useless. Some trenches had foot baths, large tubs of disinfectant. You'd come wade through them. The theory being it would kill bacteria, prevent infection. In reality, hundreds of men walking through the same tub of disinfectant just spread things around. Delousing stations were set up behind the lines. You'd go there during rest periods, strip. Your clothes would be put in a large oven, heated to kill the lice. Meanwhile, you'd shower, or rinse, or at least get wet. Then you'd put your clothes back on, still hot from the oven. It felt amazing. For about an hour, then the lice eggs, which survived the heating, would hatch, and you'd be right back where you started. Some soldiers gave up. They stopped trying to stay clean, stopped caring about the lice, the smell, the filth. They just accepted it. This is my life now. I am a mud creature. I live in filth. This is fine. Others maintained stubborn routines. They'd wash their face every morning, using a tiny bit of their drinking water. They'd try to keep one set of clothes cleaner than the others. They'd shave, even with a dull razor, even in cold water, because maintaining some routine, some sense of normalcy, kept them sane. Officers often had slightly better conditions, access to more water, better soap, maybe even a mirror. This created resentment. The class divide was visible even in hygiene. Officers could occasionally be clean, soldiers could not, but eventually, everyone was filthy. Officers, generals, even field hospitals struggled with hygiene. The entire war, the entire front, was just dirty, unclean, covered in mud, and worse. So when you imagine WWI soldiers, don't picture clean uniforms, neat haircuts, Hollywood glamour. Picture unwashed men, covered in lice, wearing clothes that can stand up on their own, smelling like death, and somehow still functioning, because that's what humans do. We adapt, we survive, even when covered in filth. So, we've covered the horror, the mud, the rats, the terrible food, the lack of sleep, the complete absence of anything resembling comfort. And you might be wondering, why didn't they all just leave, desert, go home? Surely no cause is worth this. And you'd be right, no cause was worth it. Not really. Not when you're standing knee-deep in freezing water at 3 a.m. wondering if that sound is a rat or an incoming shell. But here's the thing. The thing that kept soldiers going, the thing that made them stay, even when every instinct screamed run. It wasn't patriotism. It wasn't duty. It wasn't orders. It was brotherhood. When you've shared a trench with someone for months, when you've watched them cry, held them when they learned their father died, shared your last piece of chocolate with them, laughed at their terrible jokes at 2 a.m. while on sentry duty, they become more than a comrade, and they become family. One soldier from the London Regiment described it perfectly. He said, "We were just like a lot of brothers together. We knew we were there to do that job, and we were just like a band of brothers all the time. A band of brothers. This wasn't just about friendship, it was deeper, more primal. When you know that the man next to you will literally die for you, and you would do the same for him, that creates a bond that transcends normal human relationships. These men knew each other in ways family didn't. They'd seen each other at their absolute worst, covered in filth, sobbing from fear, angry, broken, vulnerable, and they didn't judge because they were all in it together. The nickname mate or pal wasn't casual. It meant something. Your mate was the person responsible for checking your feet for trench foot. Your pal was the one who'd wake you for your sentry shift, who'd share their rum ration if yours was lost, who'd write to your parents if you died. Soldiers formed pairs, unofficial partnerships. You looked out for each other. If your mate got sick, you'd do his work, cover his duties, lie to the officers about why he wasn't on duty, because you knew he'd do the same for you. Groups of men who arrived together, who trained together, often stayed together throughout the war. These units developed their own culture, their own jokes, their own rituals. They were tribes, mini societies within the larger army. Some units had lucky charms, group superstitions. One unit refused to light 3 cigarettes from the same match, the theory being a sniper could see the first light, aim at the second, and fire at the third. Probably not true, but everyone followed the rule because it was their rule. Others had singing traditions, certain songs sung only by their unit, or special versions of popular songs with customized lyrics, crude, often obscene, but theirs, singing together, created unity, reminded everyone they belonged to something. The officers were part of this too. Not always. Some officers kept their distance, maintained strict hierarchy, but the good ones, the ones soldiers remembered, they lived in the trenches, shared the hardships, ate the same food, faced the same dangers. Junior officers, lieutenants and captains, had it worst. They were expected to lead, to go over the top first, to make decisions that got men killed. Their average life expectancy in active sectors was 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Soldiers knew this. They saw officers arrive, eager, fresh, confident, then watched them age years and weeks, lose their optimism, become haunted, or die. Usually die. The respect between good officers and their men was mutual. Officers who cared about their soldiers, who fought for better conditions, who shared what little they had. Those officers were beloved. Men would follow them anywhere. There's a famous story, probably repeated across many units, about an officer who was offered a transfer to a safer position, better conditions, more comfortable. He refused because he said, "These are my men. I can't leave them." The camaraderie extended beyond just survival. Men helped each other in small ways, sharing cigarettes, extra socks, chocolate from a parcel. These weren't grand gestures, but in a place where you had nothing, giving something away meant everything. Letter writing became communal. Men who couldn't read would ask others to read their letters aloud. Men who couldn't write would dictate letters, and others would write them down. No one thought this was strange. It was just what you did. When someone received a parcel from home, especially food, it was shared, not just with your close friends, but with everyone nearby. A mother's cake, divided into 20 pieces, each man getting a bite. It wasn't about the food, it was about sharing the love that came with it. Humor, dark, gallows humor, was essential. Men made jokes about death, about the food, about the officers, about everything. If you couldn't laugh, you'd cry. and crying didn't help anyone. The Wipers Times, that trench newspaper we discussed, was filled with jokes that only soldiers would find funny, because only soldiers understood the context, the absurdity, the horror behind the humor. One joke that circulated: there are two types of soldiers in this war, the quick and the dead. It's not funny. Unless you're living it, then it's hilarious. Practical jokes happen too. Even in the trenches, men would play pranks on each other, hide equipment, sneak frogs into someone's dugout. Anything to break the monotony, to remind each other that they were still alive, still human. But the brotherhood also meant shared trauma. When your mate died, part of you died too. Soldiers watched friends get shot, blown apart, buried in mud, and they carried that grief, that loss, for the rest of their lives. Some men became protective, almost paternal, towards younger soldiers, the 18 and 19-year-olds who arrived terrified and inexperienced. Veterans would take them under their wing, teach them, keep them alive as long as possible. There's accounts of older soldiers, men in their late 20s or early 30s, ancient by war standards, who became surrogate fathers to teenagers who should have been in school, not in trenches. These relationships were tender, gentle, in a brutal environment. A veteran teaching a boy how to properly clean his rifle, how to spot a sniper's position, how to survive. It was an act of love, though no one would use that word. When those boys died, as many did, the veterans grieved deeply, feeling responsible, wondering what they could have done differently, what lesson they forgot to teach. The animals, those mascot pets, were part of the brotherhood too. The dog that became a unit mascot wasn't just an animal, it was a member of the family. Men would risk their lives to protect their mascot, feed it first before themselves, mourn when it died. One unit had a dog named Bruce, a messenger dog, who ran between trenches carrying important messages. Bruce was shot multiple times, survived, kept running. Men would cheer when they saw Bruce arrive, because if Bruce could survive, maybe they could too. After battles, after attacks, soldiers would search for missing comrades, risk being shot, being buried in a collapsing trench, being hit by delayed explosions, all to find their mates, to bring them back, to bury them properly, or at least try. Bodies weren't just bodies. They were men you knew, men you'd eaten with, joked with, shared cigarettes with. Leaving them in no man's land felt like betrayal. So men would go out at night under fire to retrieve them. Sometimes they couldn't. The area was too dangerous, the body too far gone, and soldiers would feel that loss, that failure, for years afterward. Letters to families of fallen soldiers were written by their mates, not by officers, by the men who knew them, who could tell parents or wives what their son or husband had been like, what they talked about, how they died. If it was quick, these letters were often lies, comforting lies. He didn't suffer. He died instantly. He talked about you at the end. Lies designed to give families peace. Because the truth, that he screamed, that he drowned in mud, that his death was slow and agonizing, the truth helped no one. After the war, many veterans stayed in touch. They formed associations, held reunions, because the only people who understood what they'd been through were the men who'd been there with them. Family couldn't understand, friends couldn't understand, but the men who'd shared that trench, who'd lived through that hell, they understood. Without words, without explanation, they just knew. One veteran said, decades after the war, "I've never been as close to anyone, not my wife, not my children, as I was to the men in my unit. We were brothers in a way that transcends blood." That's the paradox of war. It creates the worst conditions humans can experience, but it also creates the strongest bonds, because when you've survived hell together, you're connected forever. So yes, the trenches were horrible. Yes, you wouldn't last a day. Yes, it was mud and rats and death and horror. But it was also brotherhood. And for many veterans, despite the horror, despite the trauma, that brotherhood, that connection, that love between soldiers, that was the one good thing to come from it all. Now, we're going to talk about something that seems impossible, something that sounds like fiction, but actually happened. It's Christmas Eve, 1914. Just a few months into the war. Everyone thought it would be over by now. Over by Christmas. That's what the recruitment posters said. Home by Christmas. But it's not over. And you're not home. You're in a trench in Belgium. Cold, miserable, missing your family. Missing everything. The evening is quiet. Unusually quiet. No artillery fire, no machine guns, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you nervous. Because in war, silence usually means something bad is coming. Then you hear something, music, singing, but not from your trench, from the German trench, 100 yards away, across no man's land. They're singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, in German, their voices carrying across the frozen battlefield. Clear, peaceful, beautiful. And someone in your trench, a soldier who knows German, or who just knows the tune, starts singing along in English. Silent Night, Holy Night. Then others join, more voices, British, German, singing the same song in different languages together. Officers on both sides are confused, concerned. This isn't supposed to happen. Enemies don't sing together. But no one stops it because it's Christmas Eve. And everyone is tired. And everyone is far from home. As the song ends, someone, no one knows who, yells across no man's land, "Merry Christmas, Tommy." Tommy, that's what Germans called British soldiers. The British yell back, "Merry Christmas, Fritz." Then, incredibly, a German soldier climbs out of his trench, steps onto the parapet, stands there, fully exposed, in the moonlight, not holding a weapon, just standing. British soldiers, amazed, wait for him to be shot by his own officers, by someone, but nothing happens. He's just standing there, in no man's land. Another German soldier climbs out, then another. Soon there's a small group, standing in no man's land, calling out, "Come out, Tommy, we won't shoot, it's Christmas." And, incredibly, British soldiers start climbing out too, nervous, expecting a trap, expecting gunfire, but nothing, just men, standing in the cold, looking at each other. They walk toward each other, slowly, cautiously. meeting in the middle of no man's land, the place where thousands have died, where bodies still lay unburied, where death usually waits. But tonight, no death, just men, young men, German, British, shaking hands, exchanging greetings, showing each other photos of their families, their girlfriends, their homes. Someone pulls out cigarettes, British cigarettes, offers them to Germans. Germans offer their cigarettes back. Someone else has chocolate. It's shared. Someone has a flask of schnapps. It's passed around. They're speaking different languages, but somehow they're communicating through gestures, through smiles, through shared humanity. One British soldier, a kid really, maybe 19, shows his photo to a German soldier. The German smiles, pulls out his own photo. It's the same. A young woman waiting at home. The British soldier nods. The German nods. They understand each other perfectly. More men come out from both sides. Soon there's dozens, then hundreds. Officers try to stop it, but it's too late. The men have decided, tonight we're not enemies. Tonight we're just men. Someone produces a football, a soccer ball, because, of course, British soldiers carried footballs even to war, and they play British versus Germans in no man's land on Christmas Day, with barbed wire for boundaries, crater holes as hazards, and unburied bodies as silent spectators. No one knows the final score. Various accounts give different numbers, but it doesn't matter. The score doesn't matter. What matters is they played, they laughed, they competed, like it was a Saturday afternoon in a park, not Christmas Day on a battlefield. Some units didn't play football. They just talked, sang, shared stories. One German soldier was a barber in civilian life. He gave haircuts to British soldiers in no man's land. Using his field kit scissors, men lined up, got their hair trimmed by an enemy barber. They exchanged souvenirs, buttons from uniforms, cap badges, belt buckles. You take mine, I take yours. These items would be kept for years, proof that this impossible day had actually happened. Some soldiers used the truce to bury their dead, bodies that had been lying in no man's land for weeks, impossible to retrieve under fire. Now, both sides worked together, burying British and German soldiers, sometimes in the same grave. The divisions that mattered so much in life meant nothing in death. Chaplains on both sides held joint services, British and German soldiers praying together, for the dead, for the living, for an end to the war. Prayers in two languages, to the same God. It was surreal. Officers stood by, watching. Some disapproved, seeing this as fraternization with the enemy. Others were moved. Some even participated, shaking hands with German officers, discussing the war, the weather, home. The truce wasn't universal. Some sections of the front kept fighting. Orders came down forbidding fraternization. But in many places, especially British and German lines, the truce held for Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, sometimes longer. Some units maintained unofficial ceasefires for days. No shooting, no attacks, just peace, temporary, fragile, but real. Then, gradually, it ended. Orders came from high command on both sides. This cannot continue. The war must resume. Soldiers must return to their trenches, must resume killing each other. Some soldiers refused, said they couldn't shoot at men they'd just sung with, played football with, shared cigarettes with. Officers threatened punishment, court-martial, execution, slowly, reluctantly. Men returned to their trenches. The first shots after the truce were fired in the air, deliberate misses, both sides knowing what the other was doing, maintaining the fiction of war while trying not to kill anyone. But eventually, the war reasserted itself. Artillery resumed, machine guns, orders for raids, attacks. The Christmas truce became a memory, a story, something that had happened, but couldn't happen again. High command on both sides were horrified. This kind of fraternization was dangerous. It reminded soldiers that their enemies were human, had families, had lives they wanted to return to. That made killing them harder. The next Christmas, 1915, orders were explicit: no fraternization, no truces. Anyone leaving their trench without orders would be shot. Some units tried anyway, small local truces, but nothing like 1914, the spontaneous, widespread peace. That never happened again. By 1916, the war had become too bitter, too bloody. Too many friends had died. The Somme, Verdun, battles that killed hundreds of thousands. After that, the idea of singing with the enemy, playing football, it seemed impossible, obscene even. The Christmas truce became legend. Veterans would tell their children, their grandchildren, about that one day when the war stopped, when enemies became friends. For just a moment, some soldiers kept the souvenirs they'd exchanged, belt buckles, buttons, showing them to skeptical family members who couldn't believe the story. Surely it was exaggerated. Surely enemies didn't play football together. But they did. They really did. There are photographs, not many. Cameras were rare, but a few soldiers had cameras, took pictures, grainy, unclear, but showing British and German soldiers standing together, smiling. These photos were often confiscated, though destroyed. High command didn't want evidence, didn't want the truce remembered, because the truce was proof that this war, this killing, wasn't inevitable, that soldiers, when left to themselves, would choose peace, would choose humanity. The Christmas truce of 1914 asks uncomfortable questions. If soldiers could stop fighting on their own, if they could recognize their enemies as humans, as brothers even, then why were they fighting at all? The politicians, the generals, the people far from the trenches, they had reasons: national honor, strategic importance, complex alliances. But the soldiers, the men in the mud, they just wanted to go home. The truce proved that. For one day, under a Christmas sky, humanity won. Common decency, basic human connection, won. It didn't last. It couldn't last. The machinery of war, the momentum of history, the decisions of powerful men, all of that was too strong. But for one day, one incredible, impossible day, peace existed in hell. And that's something worth remembering. So, let's bring this full circle back to where we started. You, a modern person, with your comfortable bed, your heated home, your unlimited access to clean water, your antibiotics and dentists and coffee makers. Could you survive in a WWI trench? No, absolutely not. Not even close. Let me explain why. First, physical reality. Your body isn't prepared for this. You're used to sleeping 8 hours a night in a comfortable bed with pillows, blankets, climate control. The soldiers slept 3 to 4 hours, standing up in the cold on wood planks for months. Your body would break down within days. The sleep deprivation alone would impair your judgment, your reflexes, your ability to think clearly. You'd become a zombie, operating on instinct, making mistakes. Then there's the cold. You've experienced being cold, but you've never experienced being cold for months, never warming up, never drying out. That kind of cold, it doesn't just hurt, it kills. Hypothermia, frostbite. your body shutting down, and your feet. Your feet. You've probably never experienced standing in water for days, never had your feet rot inside your boots, never dealt with trench foot. Modern humans don't have the tolerance, the pain, the horror of watching your own flesh decompose. Most people would panic, break down, demand evacuation. The food. You're used to variety, flavor, fresh ingredients. The idea of eating nothing but stale bread and canned meat for months. You think you could handle it, but you couldn't. The malnutrition, the vitamin deficiencies, the constant hunger. Your body would weaken. Your immune system collapse. Then there's the hygiene, or lack thereof. You shower daily, maybe twice daily. You wear clean clothes. You brush your teeth. The thought of going weeks without washing, without changing clothes, covered in lice, that's not discomfort. That's psychological torture. Modern humans aren't used to being dirty. We're used to clean, to sanitized, to deodorized. The smell alone of the trenches would make most people vomit. And you can't escape it. You live in it, sleep in it, eat in it. The rats, the flies, the lice. You're not used to sharing your space with vermin. In modern life, if you see a mouse in your house, you call an exterminator. In the trenches, rats the size of cats run across your face at night, and you just deal with it. Most modern people would have psychological breakdowns, shell shock, PTSD, panic attacks. We're not mentally prepared for constant danger, constant fear, never knowing if the next second is your last. Modern soldiers receive extensive psychological training, support, counseling. WWI soldiers got nothing. They were expected to just handle it. And many couldn't. Many broke, went insane, were executed for cowardice when really they were just human. You couldn't handle the boredom, the endless waiting, the tedium between moments of terror. Modern humans are used to constant stimulation, phones, internet, entertainment, the idea of just sitting in a hole for hours, days, with nothing to do, no distraction, just your thoughts. That would drive you mad. You'd miss your comforts, your family, your routine. The first week, maybe you'd cope. Tell yourself it's an adventure. By the second week, you'd be desperate to leave. By the third week, you'd be planning desertion. And the medical situation, you're used to antibiotics, modern medicine. If you get sick, you go to the doctor. In the trenches, if you get sick, you might die. Simple infections, dental problems, a cut that gets infected, all potentially fatal. Your immune system hasn't dealt with these diseases, with dysentery, with trench fever, with cholera. Modern sanitation has made us weak. In a historical sense, our bodies aren't prepared for the bacterial onslaught of trench life. You couldn't handle the emotional toll. Watching friends die, not dramatically, not heroically, but randomly, pointlessly, from disease, from accidents, from a stray shell landing in the wrong place. Modern humans aren't psychologically prepared for that much death. We're used to death being rare, clinical, removed. In the trenches, death was constant everywhere. Bodies in no man's land, friends dying beside you, the smell of decay. That would break most people. You couldn't handle the helplessness, the lack of control. Modern life gives us the illusion of control. We make choices, change our circumstances. In the trenches, you had no control. Orders came from above. You followed. That's it. If you were ordered to go over the top, to walk into machine gun fire, you'd go, because refusal meant execution. Could you do that? Walk toward death, because someone ordered you to, knowing it's probably suicide. Most people couldn't. The class system would infuriate you. Officers getting better food, better conditions, better treatment. While you suffered, modern sensibilities of equality, of fairness, would clash with a rigid hierarchy. You'd resent it, question it. And in 1916, questioning orders got you shot. You're also used to communication, to knowing what's happening, the internet, news, information. In the trenches, you knew nothing. Rumors, speculation, but no real information. You didn't know how the war was going, when it might end, if your side was winning. Just darkness, that uncertainty, that lack of knowledge would eat at you. Modern humans need to know, need to understand, need context. The soldiers had none. They just existed in the moment, day after day. Let's be honest. Most of us would desert, run away, risk execution, because at least execution is quick. Better than slow death in the mud, better than months of suffering. Modern humans value individual survival over duty, and that's okay. That's healthy. But it means you wouldn't last. Even if you didn't desert, even if you stayed, your body would fail, your mind would break. The cumulative effect of stress, fear, exhaustion, malnutrition, disease, it's too much. Modern humans, for all our technology, are soft, comfortable, unprepared for true hardship. And that's not a criticism. That's good. We've built a world where we don't have to suffer like that, where we have comfort, safety, medicine. We should celebrate that. Not romanticize suffering, but it means when you look at those old photographs, when you see soldiers standing in trenches, covered in mud, exhausted, traumatized, remember, these weren't supermen. They were ordinary people, just like you, but thrust into extraordinary, horrible circumstances. They didn't have a choice. They couldn't opt out, couldn't take a break, couldn't quit. They just endured day after day, week after week, month after month, for years. That level of endurance, that capacity for suffering. Modern humans haven't had to develop it, thank God. But it also means we can't really understand, not truly, what they went through. So, no, you wouldn't last a day in a WWI trench. And honestly, that's okay, because you shouldn't have to. No one should. The soldiers of WWI weren't heroes. Not in the traditional sense. They were just men, boys really, caught in a war that didn't make sense, fighting for reasons they didn't understand, dying in mud for nothing. But they endured, they survived, they found humanity in hell, brotherhood in suffering, light in darkness. And that's something, not heroism exactly, but humanity in its rawest, most fundamental form, people taking care of each other when everything else had failed. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, in your warm bed, with your clean sheets, your comfortable pillow, spare a thought for the men who slept in mud, who never complained, who just did what had to be done, and be grateful, so grateful, that you live in a world where trenches are history, where suffering like that is remembered but not repeated, where war, while still terrible, is no longer quite so personal, quite so muddy, quite so pointlessly cruel. Sleep well. You've earned it. By virtue of being born in the right century, the trenches are gone, the soldiers are gone, but their story remains a reminder of what humans can endure, what humans can survive, and what humans should never, ever have to experience again. Good night.